Hello, everyone. I'm your host, Mark O'Brien, Director at CM First Group. Thank you very much to the IBM Guardium security folks, and welcome to today's seminar on IBM Guardium data security webcast. We'll focus on privileged users and data security. First up, I've got a poll question, and the question is, why are you interested in data privacy? HIPAA and GDPR, a third of you. Actually, the most popular one is we want to follow best practices in keeping our data safe. That over half responded to that. And then there's a fair amount of curiosity there also. And then some of you have actually had a breach, or you're certainly concerned about one. So great, thank you. I want to talk to the audience. Remember to place your questions as you hear more about today's agenda coming up. I'm going to put your console on the dashboard is a good place to write down questions, which will then be used in the Q&A. So today's agenda is very much focused on data-centric and IBM security landscape topics on the agenda. We've got a really good speaker from IBM who's going to talk about the security landscape and a number of different ways to attack and address that, followed by CM First, and our John Rhodes will be talking about protecting IBM data, and then a solution that we've found to be very helpful for IBM and other platforms of interest to our audience on data protection, and actually a demonstration on that. And then we'll follow it up with a question and answer period. So at this time, I'd like to introduce Mark Weiss, and just some information on our company if you haven't heard CM First. Yeah. So at this time, I'm going to introduce Mark Weiss, who's our CM First Partner Executive, who's going to talk about today's speaker from IBM, Stephanie Hazlewood.
Thank you, Mark, and good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining as well. Look, this is an incredible pleasure to introduce our speaker today. Stephanie Hazlewood is from IBM. She's a senior technical staff member who is responsible for driving the technical strategy and architecture, and ready for this, in the areas of data risk, data privacy, security orchestration, automation, and response. And she does this across the entire IBM security product and cloud services portfolio. Stephanie's considered an expert in data management and information governance, and her work has resulted in numerous patents, publications, and you have probably seen her in industry and academic conferences in security if you participate in those. In her free time, and we haven't figured out when she does have free time, but she is often found involved with the youth in the science, technology, engineering, and math, or the STEM events. And even beyond that, Stephanie, how do you do this? I understand that you like kind of wandering through the Canadian national parks with your family. Where do you find the time? Stephanie, we're honored and privileged to have you here, and so let me turn this over to you. And again, thank you for your time this morning.
Thank you, Mark. Okay, just as we're getting started, hello everyone, I'm Stephanie Hazlewood. I have to show this disclaimer because at no point in this this discussion today am I providing any level of legal advice. I'm not a lawyer. This is really around process advice only, and I'm a technologist. So if there's questions around the legal aspects of these things, you'll need to seek your own counsel there. Okay, so as people were saying, privacy is a hot topic, even still now in 2020. But if we think back, the principles that modern privacy regulations are based on were really established many years ago. Along the bottom of this slide, take note, in 1890, the U.S. had the right to be left alone, which was really a call to establish a protection from the paparazzi at that time. And as we move along, the first laws really came about in 1970 when the German state of Hesse had its first modern data protection law in Europe. And when we're talking about data privacy in Europe, it's better known as, more commonly known there as data protection. So modern privacy regulations are popping up fast and globally, and these are just a handful. that have been popping up. The General Data Privacy Regulation, or GDPR in Europe, the California Consumer Privacy Act in California, LGBT in Brazil, PIPEDA in Canada, and many more. And I expect these to continue to pop up. But with all of these new regulations popping up, I really want to stress how important it is to get a resilient privacy program, one that involves both identifying the technical and the organizational practices that can be applied, regardless of the new regulations or changes that are coming down the pike. So, because privacy really is a strategic imperative. We did a study last summer along with Forrester, and out of the organizations interviewed, 75% of them identified it themselves as a strategic imperative. But, here's the news flash. It's really more than that on the surface, because if a consumer doesn't trust you, they're not going to want to buy from you. It's as simple as that. An employee's not going to want to work for you, and people aren't going to want to partner with you or even make investment decisions with you. So companies are seeing this, and if we look across the landscape today, we're really seeing that ripple effect. So, for example, if your company spins up a new digital service, and you have had a privacy issue in the past, your consumers might not want to sign on to that. And if that service was intended to, provide operational efficiencies, it costs your organization in the long run. So it really makes sense that, to me anyway, that privacy truly is a strategic initiative here. So I'm going to take you through some of the lessons that we've learned from GDPR, because it's been some time now. And then I'll talk about some of the best practices and solutions that you'll want to consider when building a privacy program with the technology landscape that's out there today. So GDPR turned 1 on May 25th of last year, and it was a very exciting day with lots of press and attention given to what's going to happen next, what's going to happen, what's already happened, and it's going to turn 2 in a few short months. However, at that time last May, one of the organizations I belong to, the International Association for Privacy Professionals, or IAPP, they did a study about what had been seen throughout that year, and this chart articulates a few things about that. So there have been more fines since that time, of course. The Austrian Post had a pretty significant fine, but as of last May, the numbers were 56 million euros in fines, 144,000 complaints, and 89,000 data breach notifications. That's a lot. We also saw 500,000 registered data protection officers. So if anyone out there is looking for a career change, that might be a good one to choose. 500,000 registered data protection officers is a lot. So there's many more enforcement actions that are coming. Some are pending. And just the other day, I read that the Berlin High Court is pushing forward on the complaints against Facebook. So things are still definitely happening. I really believe that GDPR was a defining moment that woke up organizations, and that there's real reputational and financial impact to not taking care of people's personal information. And hey, I have a personal vested interest in that too. I want my information protected and that of my children's protected as well. So I'm all for this. So if we take now a look at the California Consumer Privacy Act, the CCPA, California rang in the new year this year with CCPA. And as I understand it, they're pretty litigious states. And so we're really expecting that the private right of action, or the right to sue on security violations, is really going to be a big business. So I'm going to touch more on what CCPA involves shortly. So what did we see with GDPR out there in the landscape when companies go to implement? So as we worked with clients through GDPR, we really saw these 3 types of clients. First, there was the hair, and they were very fast to implement. It was typically the banks, financial institutions, organizations that had mature and evolved data security privacy programs in place because they're highly regulated already. Healthcare also falls into that. They also have very strong governance practices. So they were really able to get ready quickly. And although in some cases too quickly, they didn't always stop to see how they could leverage the program that had been established further. Sometimes big organizations, as big as they are, were taking a project-based approach. We also saw the tortoise, operating slow and steady, but they got there. A good example of that was a large transportation company we worked with that was doing business across more than 50 countries, and they started their program back in late 2016 with a workshop, So they started pretty early, and they had a whole data classification project set up, and had all access to, had assessed their data flows about a year later. And so they had their whole IT solution design and remediation in place over the course of the year. So they got there taking their time. And in this case, it took them time to get set up organizationally, but in the end, they had a very sound and sustainable automated processes and technology in place as well. So the lesson learned here is if you rush to implement and you're spending times with spreadsheets to rush to implement, when another regulation comes back, or changes happen, you're back a few steps, and it's really not a sustainable process. So you want to take a look at your practices and automate where you can, what you can with technologies where it makes sense. And some of those are going to be covered later today in this webinar. So finally, we have the sad ostrich. They waited until the last minute wanting to know how real GDPR really was for them, or would it be postponed? And I recall hearing about one company that actually overstated their readiness and faced a shareholder lawsuit. So the lesson is, the cost could be higher than you realize. So again, I just want to reiterate that you want to put a sustainable privacy program in place. Those that did implement with automation and reusable processes in mind are further ahead because these regulations are going to continue to evolve. And you don't need to be a large multinational company to get there. We have much smaller companies. We had an electronic component distributor with 100 locations. They had only 3 people in IT, and they were able to get their data map and data protection impact assessments done in about 6 weeks' time, and they were ready for GDPR. Much smaller scale, but they had repeatable processes, so they're set up for success down the road as well. So what can you do? Prepare. Start to put that sustainable privacy program into place. This is incredibly important, especially if you're an IT practitioner. You do not want to get stuck in the minutia. You want to be relying on the legal and governance organizations to help you put that privacy program in place. And there are services with IBM and with CM First that can help you with that. IBM Promontory provides services that are, look more on the legal end or the privacy program management side of things. And they're quite helpful. You'll want to really lean on them. You also want to understand your data privacy data risk landscape. So I'm talking about, where are the data assets in your organization? Where is the personal information within those? And how do you gain the visibility and insights into those so that you're prepared to take action, and the right actions first? Because it's more than just a classification activity. And I'm not going to, it's more than just a data classification activity. You need to know where you've got so many systems that you might have to touch, which ones are most important to touch first. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this from a privacy program management perspective, but I want to give you an overview of what CCPA is, and then give you a sense of how work groups might fall out in a privacy management program. So CCPA is a consumer-directed law, and it empowers a consumer to determine how a business can store, retain, or use their own personal information. So they have some really broad rights, including the right to request the full collection of the categories and specific pieces of personal information that's been collected on them. They get to know the sources from which that data was collected, or who and what other businesses it's been shared with. And at any time, they can tell the business, any business that sells personal information, not to sell it anymore, also known as the right to opt out. They also have the right to request deletion of any personal information about them. Now, there are a number of different exceptions that have to be considered in response to this request, especially when it comes to financial or health records processing for audit and the like. But they can ask for their information to be deleted nonetheless. And the fines for not complying with any of these requests are expected to be significant. And the consumer can sue the business for not taking these actions. And that's, what is more empowering to the consumer than being told that you can actually sue an organization for not following your directive to no longer sell your personal information or share it. So when we start thinking about a privacy program, organizations need to start thinking about putting a plan or implementation plan into place. We really recommend setting up things in these different work streams, and you see them here on this slide. So when you're thinking about a new regulation in general, like what is the scope? How much of that regulation is actually applicable to your organization? In terms of personal information, you want to understand how is that being defined internally? How does that map to what this regulation is asking for? In the case of CCPA, what's your notice strategy? There's going to be, information for California, non-California residents. It's going to have to be online and physical locations. They also have the choice to opt out. So where are you going to put that do not sell choice? How are you handling that? And then there's two important work streams, very important work streams that really cause a lot of challenges and struggles in organizations, and that's around access and deletion, the individual rights. So, and some of those struggles really revolve around things like verification. How do you verify the person that's asking for the information is who they say they are? How do you make sure that the information that you're returning to them or deleting actually belongs to them? These are very challenging to companies. So, and finally, from an information security perspective, companies really need to have reasonable security practices and certainly data breach notifications, which also have private right of action opportunities as well. There's a lot to cover, and organizations that will really need to take into account these different work streams in order to tackle it. So as we move on, how do you want to understand your how do you want to understand your data privacy, your data risk landscape? And it's more than just as I was saying a little bit earlier, it's more than a classification activity. You really need to have controls and sustainable processes in place, as well as processes to deal with those individual data rights, which is challenging. It's really challenging, but well worth it, I believe, as it has implications down the road for better business practices as well. So we have a variety of solutions that can help you get there, and we won't be able to get through them all today. There are a lot of moving parts and technologies that can help you through these automations. But I encourage you to take a look at these technologies at ibm.com/security/privacy, and you'll see them put into the privacy light there when you have a little bit of time. So the first thing really is to discover what those data stores are that contain personal information. Where is it? You need to think about that geographically and also from a data residency point of view. And I would recommend starting that process with both a top-down and bottom-up approach. So, a lot of organizations will start with a questionnaire with some of your key stakeholders on the key applications that get used, and then take an automation approach, an automated classification approach based on what's being used most, and triangulate from there. Otherwise, you're going to waste a lot of time scanning, sometimes sources that just are not used heavily. So the other thing you'll want to think about is what data is already encrypted. You want to know that. Why? Because if there's a breach and the data is already encrypted, knowing what data is encrypted and where it is has implications for what you have to report. So, you may not have to report that breach if what's been accessed is unreadable. So, so there's that. You'll want to understand by regulation what repositories are at risk and be able to visualize the flows of data and understand who it's being shared with, both inside the organization and outside the organization. If you have that do not sell button on your website, you have to be able to take action to prevent that, an individual's information from being sold on request. And I think it's about 15 days, according to CCPA, in order to get that done. So you'll see more on some of these technologies again later in this webinar. So we found personal data and identified some security risk. What's next? You're going to need to get visibility, not just into the data security risk, but also the data privacy risk. As I was saying before, organizations have a lot of systems that can be in scope. So you need to know which of those to remediate first. And the way to do that is to identify the highest risk systems first to put remediation actions into place quickly. So with IBM, there is a critical data protection program, which is really just a methodology to help you do exactly that. And I think I've covered a little bit of it in approach right now in terms of how do you define what those data elements are, go find them, interviewing the stakeholders, and creating and putting a program into place to help with mitigation. And you'll get to do some of that as well. I think CM First is also going to discuss that approach, some of that approach as well. But how do you get a handle on your privacy risk itself? How do you go about that? There's really various levels of maturity out there. A lot of organizations that have done privacy risk assessments have done these manually, as I was mentioning before. And recently, there have been a number of automated privacy management tools pop up to better automate some of these interview processes. But what's still emerging are technologies that link what's been discovered from those interviews and drive that down and automate the downstream. So, and putting those security controls into place and sort of automating that right on through. Those technologies are still emerging today. So while you have the Privacy Office identifying high-risk applications and processes, there can be a disconnect today between what the Privacy Office is finding and making sure you're taking the right actions first. And we have tools like IBM Data Risk Manager that can help with some of those integration points with these privacy management tools and help articulate where those hot spots are to address first. It's kind of like having a dashboard that brings together what you understand from the privacy management program together with the security risks that you found from discovery and classification of information from products like Guardium that you're going to see later in this webinar in a single place. So it's important to have this perspective, because the next step is an important one. You can't remediate and protect unless you have that full visibility. So the next step is just what I said. So let's get on to that final step around remediation and protecting. How are you going to respond to consumer rights requests, right? How long is it going to take to get those done? You need to understand what it's going to take based on your enterprise, how information is spread across your enterprise. What audit trails do you want to have in place? These aren't necessarily required by all the regulations, but if you have a complaint, I'd suggest you want to have an audit trail. You also want to monitor activity so you know who is accessing personal data and when. And then you need to have sustainable procedures in place to be able to detect and respond to data breaches. So just a couple of things to focus on here, especially around consumer rights. You're going to want to consider how many consumer rights requests the organization is projecting. So working with the Privacy Office, you'll get a better understanding of what they're thinking. It'll help you better understand to what extent that particular process will need to be automated. So if your organization is consumer facing, it's possible in the early days of regulations like CCPA, you're going to get a lot of consumer requests, depending on what kind of consumer you have. In addition, you want to consider how you're going to be able to validate that the person that's requesting the information is who they say they are. That's really important. It's a big challenge. A lot of governance programs out there spend a lot of money making sure they got the single version of the truth for their customers. And now all the data that you're going to have to collect and return to them is in all these disparate systems that might not be as highly governed as those projects. That those projects have invested significant amounts of money to articulate and form together that profile. I'm talking about the master data management, projects. They're very expensive, highly governed information. Now you've got to figure out how to collect it all. With that level of confidence that what you're returning to the requester actually belongs to them, and what to do with that information where you're not confident. What are you going to do with it? Make those decisions. So what I'm showing here is just a template for an automated consumer request processing provided with IBM Resilient. Again, it's important to consider what automation you actually need. The cost savings can be significant, but if you're not going to get a lot of consumer requests off the bat, depending on the organization, you might go lighter on this level of automation. So I've covered a lot here in a short time, understanding this is just an hour session we have with you today. So I think you'll get to see some of the technology in action that's going to help you promote data privacy with your organization. These are just some of the, we really want you to be able to, promote data privacy, build trust, and differentiate your business, and while putting these security controls into place. And as I shared earlier, you know, you'll see a lot of different patterns to adoption, and none of them are perfect. You know, it takes a long time to sort of get to the to get to be. It can take a significant amount of time to get to a mature privacy program, but it doesn't mean that you can't make it at your own pace. So despite the path chosen, both IBM and CM First certainly have the services and tools to help organizations on this privacy journey. With that, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you, Stephanie. It was quite a whirlwind tour of the wide, wonderful world of data security. I think we have another poll question coming up at this point. So poll question number 2 is, what are you currently doing to secure data? Now, I was thinking as Stephanie was talking about the consumer protection, some of us that are really have B2B business customers, it doesn't mean their data is still very, very highly important and must be protected as well too. So big winner is controlling entitlements or logging access. Really interesting, kind of looking at it from inside out. Followed by encrypting and masking data. Half of you to get that's priority, and then the others are less important. Would be metadata catalogs or regular vulnerability assessments. So it seems like that there's an interest in kind of nipping this thing in the bud before things are a problem. Seems to be the theme there with those answers. So thank you for that. Now I'm going to turn it over to John Rhodes, who's the Chief Technical Officer and Managing Director of CM First Group. He's going to give you an overview on focus demo and then a specific demo for IBM Guardium for data protection. And remember, you can still add questions on your console.
All right, thanks Stephanie, thanks Mark. Yeah, that was a great high-level overview, I thought, from Stephanie on kind of what's out there around security and what's necessary and kind of the big picture. So I'm going to take it down a level to a specific technology that we found very useful for people to get started, especially people that are running on the IBM I platform, which is a big focus for our company. And so I'm not going to discuss everything. Certainly, that security is something you could go to a whole week conference on and still not scratch the surface almost. But I'm going to talk about some of the things that Stephanie mentioned, like discovery classification. How do you find the data that's living on your IBM I and that you want to protect, like social security number, like credit card numbers? Okay, how do you secure those? And then how do you monitor access? Okay, let's say you've had a breach. You want to find out about that breach as soon as possible and take some action. Okay, so I'm going to kind of show you the technology around that, which is IBM Guardium. Okay, so one of the family of products from IBM, and show you some technology here that can help you pretty quickly. And here's, I think, a question that you may be, as an IT person, asked by management or maybe even by the board of the company, and not having an answer to this is not good. And really, it's how do you prove that privileged users have not accessed or jeopardized your sensitive data, right? So here is where a lot of the breaches happen. And like Stephanie mentioned, okay, you may be already doing encryption for your columns and such, but guess what? If you're a privileged user, security officer, whatever, they're not going to be worried about that encryption. Okay, they're going to be able to see all that data. So you need a level beyond just encryption of the data. And what can happen is, either there's a privileged user in your company that is nefarious, perhaps, or more commonly, they've just managed to let their credentials escape them. That's what you read about in the news all the time, where there's been a breach like that gas company over in the Ukraine. I mean, hackers went in and they emailed all the security officers and just asked for their password, and guess what? They got it a lot of the times. So that's really what something that Guardium can specifically help that you may not have thought about. So Guardium is a data-focused solution It does have a lot of different layers. Works very well with the IBM I, and that's what I'm going to go into next. Okay, so we're talking about data. Talk about data lives in databases and data lives also in files. And we're not talking about firewalls and a lot of the other things that come along with security. But data is something that just the heart of the matter, really. So why do we like Guardium for our customers? What have they found really useful? One is it's a very mature product. It's been around for a number of years. It's been through a lot of breaches and helped customers respond to those breaches very effectively. That's one thing. Another thing is that it runs natively on the IBM I, and being an IBM product, you kind of expect that. But having these native agents, especially on the I, but also other platforms, other databases like Microsoft SQL Server, Oracle, and pretty much everything out there that you're likely to have, it can cover the entire data landscape for you. So I know a lot of folks that probably on this call are very IBM I specific, DB2 specific, but usually that means you also have data that's living in SQL Server or the file system or Oracle or just a number of other things. So that's at least the typical customer we have has data outside DB2. So it's important that this product cover all those platforms that you may be interested in. Okay, third thing is that it runs at the kernel level on I. As you can imagine, when you're setting up monitoring of your sensitive data on a production system, you can't let that affect production workload and response times. Obviously, it can affect it a little bit, but with the IBM solution, it runs at the kernel level, so you have the least impact on production workloads. And I think that's very important for people, especially with large systems. I mean, if you can imagine, a lot of customers we come in contact with have hundreds of libraries containing tens of thousands of tables, and then you multiply that by a number of columns, you got a lot of data elements and a lot of logging that could potentially happen. And it's got a lot of other good features like APIs, and it's also at a very competitive price point. As Stephanie mentioned, a 3-person IT shop can put this in the budget and get some immediate use. It's not something that's going to take millions of dollars to implement. Certainly it can scale for a large organization, it scales, but it also works very well for a small organization. Okay, so let's kind of dive in now. So I'm going to show just a few things on Guardium and hopefully see if there's interest there. And if you guys have interest, then one of the next steps we'll go through would be to schedule a 2-hour deep dive where we can have some real technical experts on the line to really go through every aspect of the product, and then kind of throw it open to questions. And we really make these really open-ended where you just can ask whatever you want and we'll show you interactively in the product. But today I'm just going to show a kind of a basic high level to see if there's interest. Okay, and let me switch over to Guardium. Okay. Log back into the appliance. Okay, so Guardium itself runs on Linux, but it has agents that attach to the different operating system, different database platforms. So I'm showing you the main interface, which is a web-based interface. Okay, so I'm going to show you a couple things here. So, first thing you would do, of course, is set up your system, and that certainly has some level of complexity depending on how many systems you have. But what you're typically going to do is going to set up, just a few different connections or STAPs, okay, into your data. Okay, so let's go look at some of this information here. So I'm going to go into Discover. Okay, I'm going to go into Classification. Let's take a look at some of the database definitions. So here's some we've set up already. Okay, so you can see that you can set up any number of connections to your IBM I systems, also SQL Server and Oracle and MySQL and a whole bunch of other things. So first step is to set up on the IBM I, you set up an STAP and you connect to that STAP, okay? And so that's something that can be done pretty quickly. Okay, so next thing I want to show you is how you look at the data and discover the sensitive data that's on your IBM I tables. Okay, so here's the option for it here discover sensitive data. And you can see that Guardium has a number of templates already kind of predefined for you for discovery. So I can pick a template or I can start from scratch. I'm going to show you one we've been working with here. Look at this IBM sample on IBM I here. Okay, so now we're looking for data on our IBM I specifically. Okay, and we have a kind of a wizard here where I can show you name and description and kind of what to discover. It's kind of the heart of it, right? Okay, so what are you looking for? You know, it depends on the nature of your business, but you know, typically you're going to be very concerned about card numbers. I think that applies to consumers and business these days. Bank numbers, you know, and so you can see that Guardium has helpfully defined almost everything you can possibly think of around private data, and really around the world even. Okay, but I can go in and I can find things like driver's license in California, so security number, even getting down to affiliations, clubs, I guess, in Denmark, chromosome information. So just every possible data element you probably can think of is here. And guess what? If it's not there, you can set it up yourself, you know, on whatever data you want to do. So what I do is I find the information over here, I move it over to the right-hand side right here, and this is the information that applies to my business and to my basically my situation, my data. Okay, so kind of a simple process there. I can go in and make edits to these. So if I wanted to, for example, look at a email. Okay, this has been predefined by IBM, but I can put my own regular expression in here. I can decide if I want to limit my scope to looking at tables or views, what kind of data type I'm looking for. In this case, it's number or text. Probably text is more appropriate. And I can kind of put my own regular expression in here too. So nice little regular expression builder here. And I can do a test expression and kind of see what might be affected by an email address, for example. So if I put a valid email address in there, I should see that, yeah, this turns green. So it's going to find all email addresses in certain columns in this case. Okay, so this is certainly something that, you know, it takes a little time to set up. You may know intuitively what data you're trying to protect, but probably you're going to have to, you know, talk to the business and find out what really is most important, you know, the privacy office or people in the business unit, what they're going to want to do to protect their data. Okay, so cancel out of that. Okay, so I can also select in where to search. Okay, you know, do I want to look for it just on the IBM I, or do I want to look on across all databases? Okay, then run the discovery. Typically, you'll schedule that to run, and then you can start to look at and see what you found. So I'll say for a lot of our customers, this is not a trivial task to find all your data, all your sensitive data across all your tables. So when I run this rule here, I quickly got, you know, some quick results from a previous scan, and I can see quickly, you know, what library this is going to be in, what the table is, what the column is, and then on the IBM I, we often are subject to these very cryptic column names. So you're not going to find, you know, necessarily what you want in the column name, but you can find it because it scans the data. It scans about 2,000 rows of data and makes a decision if that's sensitive or not. So yeah, I found a number of problems here. Or not problems, but things I need to potentially secure. Okay, I can look at an audit and I can schedule that. So that's kind of the basic process of around discovering the data that's on your I. Something you'll want to set up and have run periodically and monitor periodically, and then pick out the important columns that, you know, are really important for you to start monitoring. Okay, so that's the next thing I wanted to show you. Okay, so once you've found and discovered the data, what you want to do is then look into, you know, protection of the data, right? And the heart of Guardium is around security policies. It lets you set up some very detailed policies or very simple policies that will start monitoring your data on your DB2 databases, also in the file system. So it can look for information in letters or information in files, and often that's one of the most vulnerable points. It's not the database, because the database may be encrypted very well, tightly controlled, but sometimes we have files out there, report files and such, they're just kind of lying out there in the IFS or lying out there in the file system, and people can get at those. So we can do both files and data. I'm going to focus on data today. Okay. But you can see here that, again, IBM has very helpfully provided a lot of default policies. Okay, so depending on what regulations you're subject to and what you're trying to do, probably you'll find a starting place on the policy itself. Okay, I'm going to take a look at this data access policy that we've enabled here. Maybe edit that. And really, this is something that takes, you know, some training and some study to get set up properly. But I can start to run very detailed policy rules that say, okay, I'm going to look at data in the particular database. I'm going to look at particular columns, and I'm going to take particular actions based on what I find. Okay, so this is kind of the next step, is to go in, look at your policies, enter policies that are based on the columns you found in the discovery process, and then you'll start to monitor that. So you can't monitor every column and every table. It's like boiling the ocean. You will have a performance impact from doing that, and also you'll just have way too much data to even make sense of. So the key thing is that first you discover where the data is, and then you monitor those particular tables and columns that are of most interest and most represent the most risk for your company. Okay, so that's policies. Let me show like one more thing here, just to kind of give you a flavor again for the product. Let's take a look at dashboards. So there's a lot of reports and dashboards and alerts and all kinds of stuff built in. I just want to kind of give you a flavor of that. And you can see that I can see how I'm doing on progress here. How many databases have I discovered based on what I've started doing policies for, what are monitoring, what are being actually looked at. Do I have violations? On our system, fortunately, we don't, but you start to see possibly violations there. So I can kind of quickly take action when someone has gone in. Maybe I have a policy set up where I'm looking for a SQL statement against a table that has credit card numbers in it, and usually that wouldn't happen because only maybe a programmer who needs to do some kind of action on that table might run SQL, but typically we don't allow that. It's all done through the application program. So I might start seeing that, and that will start seeing an alert here, and I can start to take action on it. Okay. Nothing that's kind of built into it is looking at vulnerabilities. And vulnerability assessment is kind of a key thing here. There is one built in for the IBM I as well as other platforms. Okay. I can say, for example, I have an IBM I vulnerability assessment here. I can view the results. And I can get some overall information very specific to the IBM I. Okay, so this is a key thing you're not going to find in a generic security tool, because it's something that's from IBM and built for I. Okay, I can start to see some things like, hey, do I have profiles with all object? Too many of those. Obviously need some of those, but there's more here than maybe I want. And again, on our system, we're not super worried about security, so we have probably a lot of failures that you wouldn't have in a production instance. But this is something also you can use as a tool to make sure your system is hardened to the extent possible, and then take action on it. Now, at least we have no users with expired passwords, for example. Okay, so I hope that gave you a bit of a flavor for what IBM Guardium for data protection does. Really, it's a way to find data on your IBM I and SQL Server, Oracle, do policies to monitor access by privileged individuals and other individuals, and then to configure alerts and configure logging, and then finally to take action against any possible breach. Now that's kind of the key thing, is you're going to have a breach at some point. It's sort of inevitable. And when you do, how do you take action? Well, if you don't have the logging and you haven't taken the steps to put something like Guardium into place, you're going to have a really hard time figuring out what people accessed during the breach, what exactly happened, and what you're going to tell your customers and your board and all that. So that's the reason why this type of product is I think very valuable for people on the eye. Okay, so that was the kind of the demo. Let me switch back to presentation. Okay, just kind of running through what we already saw, so I'm not going to really talk about this. Some additional dashboards you can get in the product. Okay, so I'm going to stop there on the demo and technical discussion and turn things over to Mark O'Brien to answer questions and kind of wrap things up.
Great. Thanks, John. That was a really powerful demonstration. Because of that and the complexity of the product, we have an offer for everyone who's attending today. Your choice of actually 3 different ways that you can go, depending on your animalistic behavior there on the right. So first of all, we're going to offer a 2-hour complimentary discovery meeting. We would have both CM First and IBM experts in that meeting, or you could schedule a technical deep dive with a detailed demo that would cover IBM, SQL Server, Oracle, so forth and so on, with a with a real product expert. Or we could look at defining a security pilot project, again based on experts on are you behaving, is your company behaving like a hare or a tortoise or an ostrich, and and we could just take it along the lines there about what should happen by when, and kind of show you on a high level about what can be possible with solutions like Guardium. At this point, presentation is concluded, and we're going to go into a Q&A session. And so I'm going to ask people, please, if you've got any more questions on the console, please type them into us. I have first question here is, we're not located in California, but we've got customers there. Do the California rules apply to us? And that'd be directed to Stephanie.
Yes, they do. Because if you're doing business, if you're doing business in California, you're a business and you're doing business in California with California resident information, you do need to handle their information as per that act. So yes, they do apply to any organization that's doing business in California, online or physically, where data that belongs to California residents is being processed or shared.
Okay, and it counts to California companies too, right? Organizations that are established in California? That's
right. If you're doing any sort of business in California, then yes, this applies to you. Okay.
Next question is, does this product integrate with SEIMs like Splunk and Slack? Again for you, Stephanie.
So in terms of which products, so we certainly, when you're looking at automation for breach response and that sort of thing, certainly our orchestration and automation tools absolutely integrate with SIMs, and so yeah, the answer to that is yes.
Okay.
I could just maybe expand to that. We've had some organizations that wanted to use Slack, and the things like that, doesn't really matter what it is. There's an API for it. So if there's no built-in integration, I'm speaking specifically about IBM Guardium now. you can build your own integration quite easily.
Mm-hmm. Good. Next question would be for John. How long does it take for us to get up and running on the IBM I?
That's a great question. Obviously, it depends. I mean, some folks have 10 IBM Is or more. Some folks have just one. I'd say what we usually start with would be a pilot project, and we pick a single IBM I instance, and we work with about 10 different tables and discover data. And that project can be done usually in about 3 weeks. We can install on the IBM I and on the Linux partition. We can find the secure data, put some policies in place, put some reporting in place, and kind of train you on how to keep things going and how to go from there. And that usually is a 3-week project. Obviously, larger installations that have multiple IBM Is or multiple SQL servers, and it kind of varies from there. So it just I think, but that's kind of the entry point, about 3 weeks.
Okay. And you mentioned a Linux partition, so Guardium does run on a Linux partition on the I?
It can in some cases. Don't have much. Personally, I haven't that much experience with that, but it definitely runs more commonly, and it doesn't have to, but more commonly just runs a Linux partition that's on a VM in your data center, alongside the I.
Okay. Another question beyond how long it gets up and running. Once it's up and running, can you give any more detail on possible performance impacts or the way that the setup is that could influence the performance impact of running this rule?
Yeah, that's another good question, and kind of the answer is it depends. It really comes down to the amount of data you're logging. So if you only have a few tables in production that have sensitive data, then it's be very, very minimal impact. If you have hundreds of thousands of tables with sensitive information you need to log, then it's going to be higher. But again, the IBM approach, working at the kernel level, the impact will be a lot less than other approaches to look at log data.
Mm-hmm. This final question here is that someone writes in that they've got 2 IBM Power machines and several SQL Server instances. Can you ballpark pricing what something like that would look like?
Well, that's going to be a tough question. We'll say that just ballpark numbers is when you look at an IBM I partition, usually you're going to have at least one production instance, and that that's going to be, the software itself is going to be less than 20,000 for that, and then you have, of course, the installation. But typically speaking, you could do a pilot project with IBM I partition and with SQL Server for $50,000 or less, including the software and including all the services around that and getting up to speed yourself. So it's not something that's out of reach for a lot of organizations that have data that they simply must protect. Certainly, it's the ROI on that if you have a breach is astronomical.
1%.
Yeah.
Of what the cost of a breach would be. Okay. I think at this point, and I don't see any other questions up. We can go to our final poll question at this point. It's just a question of how are you going to follow up. This is non-binding answers, but you think about where your organization is, and is it behaving like a hare or a tortoise or an ostrich? An assessment or a pilot, or researching other vendors and other approaches. I know the agent capabilities on the IBM distinguish it from other competitive offerings, and then for those who are really well prepared, say I'm already doing everything that's necessary. So I say based on the comments that people are interested and be looking, but not to anything specific. So anyway, if you're interested in looking at at a complimentary discovery call, please let us know, and is how to contact us at CM First in Austin, Texas, our America's headquarters. And that does conclude today's webcast. We'll be having another one up this quarter, later on in the quarter. And everyone who's on this webinar will also receive an invitation to the next webcast. So thank you very much to Stephanie and John and Mark for your kind attention today, and also our audience members. This concludes our webinar. Have a great week. Thanks, everyone.